Now, you've probably seen plenty of reviews focusing on areas of gameplay, good and bad, but today I'd like to discuss something that I think is at the very heart of everything wrong with this game. Yes, I will talk about gameplay mechanics, visuals and the difficulty, but I'd like to focus on the biggest problem, which is the story. As I was writing this, something struck me. That is how that Halo finds itself in a similar position to many of the franchises from our childhoods. The original creators are either not involved or brought in as executive producers or consultants, and the new creators don't understand what made the original so popular. In this regard, I believe Halo is a lot like Star Wars franchise at this point. Consider that in both franchises, the original concept and story is complete with the conclusion of the original trilogy, and each must find its own reason to exist. The owners of the IP find themselves with a galaxy of possibilities and characters that people love. So what are they to do? Leave the story alone for us to look back on fondly, or expand the story with more installments? At this stage, both franchises face the same problem. Where does the story go when a galaxy-spanning threat has already been averted, the bad guys defeated, and a hero's story arc completed? While Lucasfilm decided to soft reboot the franchise with The Force Awakens, Halo 4 attempted to both expand the lore of the galaxy with the proper introduction of the Forerunners, the Librarian, and the Didact, while also making the story more personal between Cortana and Chief. Halo 5 continued this with the AI story arc, and Halo 6 or Infinite should have concluded it. In many ways, the Halo story of Infinite is similar to The Force Awakens. Both are essentially soft reboots of the original installment of the franchise. The same bad guys are back with a new coat of paint, and the familiar settings are back. The familiar characters return in a new form, and the story follows the same beats. Destroy a planet-killing laser or disable a galaxy-killing Halo ring. The graphics and special effects are updated, and many of the details are different, but the overarching story is the same as the first installment. It's at this point that Halo Infinite ceases to be like The Force Awakens and begins to look like the rise of Skywalker. Both are the third part of a trilogy, and both disregard the previous two installments' contents to tell their own story. Halo 6 should have seen the story resolve the AI crisis from Halo 5, but instead it switches out the created for the banished in the same way that the Rise of Skywalker swapped out the First Order for Palpatine and the Final Order. Both bad guys are retreads of familiar villains. The creators are hoping to tap into viewer and player nostalgia to distract us from the fact that this new version just isn't as good as the original, and the story set up in the previous installments wasn't what the fans wanted to see. Neither set of villains has anything to do with the threat set up in the previous two installments. The First Order are quickly dispensed with as the main threat in the opening crawl, and the AI and Guardians are nowhere to be seen and quickly replaced by Atriox and the Banished. Both franchises seem keen to listen to the fans, but here we are presented with motifs, set pieces and villains from a more fondly remembered time. In the case of Halo Infinite, I believe this is a mistake and one which colours the whole experience of playing through the Halo Infinite campaign. Halo 6 should have taken a different approach. Rather than essentially ignoring Halo 5, 343 should have leaned into it. A more satisfying, more interesting take would have been to drop the Banished in alongside the Created, forcing Cortana to re-evaluate her priorities in the face of this new threat. The Created would have been defeated, which provides closure on the Halo 5 campaign, whilst leaving us in roughly the same place ready to fight the Banished, or whoever else in whatever expansions 343 has planned. But most importantly, the player will get to experience the final anguish of what befell Cortana, which provides a fitting narrative to the end of a story that, let's face it, most fans never wanted told in the first place. Ah, Cortana, how badly you've been treated. Name me another franchise which is still doing well where one of the main characters was killed off screen. Cortana was a key component in the success of Halo. She brought moments of levity and humanity to the first four games in contrast to Chief's largely gruff, robotic presence, and to treat the character in such a disrespectful way stinks.
Sod off!
We see now the problems of not having a vision bigger than one game at a time, and with no overarching story, the second trilogy of Halo is a narrative mess. I can see what they were shooting for. The Cortana character needed to grow.
You've changed.
It was time.
But instead of making her the bad guy in Halo 5, they could have used her as a foil during an AI crisis where all other human AI turn on their masters and she is conflicted. Halo Infinite could have picked up where the story left off, and Zeta Halo could have seen the final battle between the AI, the Banished, the Covenant and the USC or anybody else. But if this wasn't possible, the very least we could have asked for was that 343 own their choices and finish what they started. When franchises dispense with whole storylines, they inadvertently tell the fan base that the story they're watching or playing through has no consequences. It can be retconned or ignored at any moment. If that's the case, then why should we continue to spend time, money, or emotional investment in supporting your product? My main problem with the campaign relates to the story, and as it permeates everything within those missions. It relegates the main threads of the Halo 5 campaign still to be resolved to flashbacks. Yes, we see a resolution to that story, but all of this happens off screen, so it feels like our actions have little consequences for the players personally. It feels like we're just playing catch up the whole time. There are a few narrative threads left hanging at the end, and the reveal at the end is intriguing. It sets up a lot of possible future stories, but it doesn't make it fun to play through. I was choked up at the end saying goodbye to an old friend, but the more I think about the resolution to the Cortana problem, it annoys me. Cortana could have been a living presence helping us through the game, before finally making the ultimate sacrifice and being replaced by a younger sister. Instead, we're helped from beyond the grave, which just doesn't pack the same emotional punch. She's dead already, and this is telegraphed, if not outright stated early on in the story. Personally, I think this was a mistake, and they could have retconned the bad choices made in Halo 5 by resetting the same character or implanting the original Cortana's memories into the weapon to preserve the relationship between Cortana and Chief. Although even this would have been blatant fan service, so perhaps Cortana having to redeem herself a little, and the chance to see the weapon mature into a fully fledged grown-up will be more satisfying as Halo Infinite matures, and we eventually forget that this is a new Cortana. To my mind, the campaign feels like it was reworked from something far more ambitious. The bread and butter parts of the campaign are repetitive, with the meat of the story told through flashbacks and cutscenes, rather than something happening in the moment in the game. And God, how many times did we watch this animation? Surely this came up in early gameplay testing. The campaign missions are essentially all the same, and it suffers from being semi-open world. The campaign missions get lost in the rest of the world instead of being tightly focused areas with their own identity. Now, I'm sure we all have a favourite level from the original trilogy, perhaps something that we play through every now and then because it's so much fun or we enjoy the challenge. I've played this campaign a couple of times now and honestly struggle to remember any of the missions on their own. It's all just one big Halo Infinite mess. And did we really have to fight the adjutant twice? Instead, this time could have been taken to flesh out the banished lieutenants more, either through more dialogue or more encounters or on our way to the final destination. Speaking of boss fights, the villains or bosses in this game are poor. That's not to say they aren't challenging, but rather the story gives us little reason to care about them, but it appears to want us to. This isn't the first time 343 have been guilty of this. They were prominently placed in the trailers and they appear in cutscenes and have lines of dialogues, but we don't know who they are or why we should be afraid of them or care about them. The Spartan Hunters were a good idea, and perhaps had we faced more of them, perhaps getting harder as we go along, then these encounters would have been more engaging. These feel like disjointed encounters rather than the player being hunted by a pack of killers who pose a real threat, which would have been far more interesting. The worst of these bosses is Jaeger and Domini. I hope I've said that right. He's prominently placed in the trailers, and given the reaction of some YouTubers, you'd think he was a major character in the game. Unfortunately, he isn't much more than a distraction. A cool set of armor on legs, really. Apparently he's uber scary, but we see nothing of him until we face him, after which he dies. A cutscene of him torturing Marines, or a shorter boss fight earlier in the game where he kicks our ass would have set up a final fight with some stakes. Or perhaps even drop him into the map as we pass through it. He could be seen watching us at a distance, and if you get too close, he disappears. It could have been really spooky and made us feel claustrophobic in the open world. Having said that, the fight against him is atmospheric, but on normal difficulties it's just not hard enough. Rather than this collection of loose encounters, why not set up a cadre of lieutenants, Spartan killers, assassins, chiefs and generals, each dispatched as the last fails. Also show them committing these heinous acts so that we know the threat we're facing is real. Next on my chopping block of hate is the Harbinger. This pointless character is dropped in and we know next to nothing about her. All we know is that she wants to freely end us, but not much else. Who are they? What do they want? And why should we care? Haven't we been here before? These are all questions to be answered at a later date. This feels intentional as Halo Infinite is supposed to be a 10-year game, but that doesn't make it any more engaging for the players right now. To be fair to Halo Infinite, the charge of repetitive design and encounters was also leveled at Halo CE. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that the same issues affect this game as it's essentially a soft reboot of the series. The part that CE got right, however, was the tight relationship between level design and available weapons. Halo CE feels like a puzzle which can be unlocked with great strategy and weapon selection. Infinite feels like a massive sandbox of Halo-themed toys, and the developers are letting us play in. Which brings us to the weapon balance. I truly believe that you could complete the whole game with AR, grappling hook and grenades. I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but previous Halo titles feel like a puzzle where you have to take the right weapon to the right fight and use it in the right way. At least to make it easy on yourself. This feels like 343 counted up all the things that make Halo Halo and just told the player go play. The grappling hook is overpowered and makes movements somewhat cartoony. It feels like they've taken the advanced movement of Halo 5 and simultaneously nerfed it and made it even more ridiculous. But it's a good thing that they have, because it avoids hours of walking between targets, which would get dull pretty quickly. Which is fine out in the open world. However, in the more confined spaces of the campaign missions, the grappling hook acts as both a weapon and a get out of jail free card. If you don't like the position you've taken, just throw a grappling hook and you're on the other side of the room. This removes, or at least changes, the amount of strategy you need to deploy to win an encounter. Now, fights are more fluid and, within the context of the game, more realistic, but I'm not sure this makes them more fun. The grappling hook, which allows us to break encounters by making Chief do things that the devs never considered or accounted for. Ledges can be reached, boxes stood on, and drops no longer pose a threat. Just look across YouTube. It seems everyone is glitching boss encounters. In fact, you can check out my video here to see me beat Esheron with just melee. Ah, the visuals. The cause of the initial delay in releasing the game, and thank God they did put it back, because graphically the game is stunning. But I thought this was a negative review, I hear you say. Well, it is stunning and boring. The entire map looks the same. You'd be hard pressed to tell one area from another. In Halo Infinite, the Banished and Halo installations are both muted shades of grey. Okay, fine, the Halo interiors are shiny silver, but it's a similar muted palette with little to distinguish them apart. Perhaps the Banished are a more industrial design, but it isn't enough of a differentiator for me. Again, this feels like a symptom of a game which has been diminished in scope because of the development trouble or other delays caused by the pandemic. Perhaps those delays would have seen an even more diverse set of biomes. Instead, we're stuck with endless forest and mountains to climb. Or perhaps this is now part of a deliberate strategy to stretch Halo Infinite out over its proposed 10-year lifespan. I'm sure other parts of the ring will look vastly different, and we'll see these in the fullness of time, but that doesn't make things better in the game's current state. The open world and availability of advanced UNSC hardware makes it too easy in places. Why bother taking on a base full of Banished when you can park up a tank and pepper them from a distance? Yes, legendary difficulty is hard, but traversing the map with a squad full of Marines, each equipped with whatever overpowered, endless ammo having weapon loadout you can dream up is no challenge at all. It's fun for 5 minutes and different loadouts might add some replayability, but I don't see this campaign going down as beating 1, 2, 3 ODST or reach for campaign longevity or replayability. Yeah, just check out my fears video for how I think the community will react in the long run. Halo Infinite has a planned 10-year lifespan, and perhaps in 2 or 3 years time, once campaign DLC drops, this strategy will look like genius. The story will be fleshed out, the art style more varied, missions will be memorable, campaign playlists will be implemented, and players will eagerly await Master Chief's efforts to take back Zeta Halo and save humanity again. Until then, we're stuck with an open world sandbox which, whilst fun to play in every now and then, doesn't hold the same long-term appeal as its predecessors. If you watched this far, then thanks for your time, I really appreciate it, and if you want to see more content like this, then please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell.